مرحبا بكم في Abratalks. Welcome to Abratalks. Bienvenidos a Abratalks. ברוכים הבאים ל-Abratalks. Bienvenue sur Abratalks. Benvenuti su Abratalks.
In this new episode of Abratalks, the podcast of Abrahamic that gives a voice to those reshaping the MENA region, my guest is Aurèle Tobelem, historian and director of research at the Forum for Foreign Relations. Born in France, Aurèle lives now in the UK, but he's deeply attached to his Moroccan Jewish culture, which drives his work as a counter-extremism expert and as an Abrahamic peacebuilder. Enjoy listening. Hi, Aurèle.
Hi, Pauline. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm very happy to host you in this Abratalks conversation that we are recording at a crucial moment for the MENA region, a few days after the release of the hostages and the ceasefire in Gaza. We tried to do it several times before, and we were interrupted each time by the different upheavals in the region. So thanks again for accepting my invitation. A few words maybe about what's happening right now before evoking together your personal journey and your personal story.
Of course. Thank you very much, Pauline. As you've said, every time we did try to record these podcasts, there were constant upheavals. And so we thought it best to include them. We've seen, as you said, a Gaza ceasefire. Thank God the living hostages, 20 of them, are now back on Israeli soil where they belong. After brutal time in Hamas captivity over 700 days. What we've seen is nothing short of sensational. The speech that President Trump gave to the Knesset, where he was very, very well received, I must say, with the exception of two MPs, one an Israeli Arab and one an Israeli Jew, who did attempt to disrupt that speech with accusations of genocide, etc. But it was a momentous occasion, and I was very happy to watch it all unfold from here in London. But the most important thing is that the actual offensives and the hostilities between the IDF and Hamas are now coming to a close. There is going to be demilitarization. De-radicalization is something we need to focus on as well. But right now, things are more stable than they were even a week ago.
We will have time during the conversation to evoke this in further details. You're a historian, Aurèle, and you are working as director of research at a British think tank called the Forum for Foreign Relations. Your journey is rather uncommon for someone of your generation, if I may say. Since your professional activities combine counter-extremism and peace-building with a strong academic dimension, but it's your family history that helps understand your commitments between three countries, which are the UK, Morocco, and Israel. I would love to hear you tell us how it all began by starting with your personal background. What are your origins, Aurèle, and where were you born?
Of course. So yes, as you rightly say, I'm a historian, I'm a writer, I'm also a cultural strategist and a geopolitical researcher. My work mainly explores Jewish-Muslim relations, visual culture, and the role of propaganda in shaping perceptions of the Middle East. Much of this work actually draws on my Moroccan Sephardi heritage. My family were very prominent in various circles of Moroccan elites during the time that they spent in Morocco. I believe the precise number of years is about 7 centuries. And for me, I was always informed by this. I was born in France. Unfortunately, my parents didn't have the luxury of being born somewhere a bit warmer. I grew up for about 5 years in France before coming here to an even colder place known as the United Kingdom. And it was quite frankly always inculcated in me that we were Jews, but that our Jewish roots were in Morocco, and that we adhered to our Moroccan Jewish traditions, to our songs, to our cuisine, to the various languages that were spoken, particularly in Protectorate Morocco and Tangier, which is where my family lived. And so a lot of my family were born speaking Spanish. And so it was very common for me to connect to this identity. When I started connecting to the actual country itself, even though I regret to say that I've only been there once in my childhood, when I started connecting to Morocco as a country and as a nation with its own interests was during the Abraham Accords. And it was actually in 2022, when I was 19, that I was invited to the residence of the Moroccan ambassador, His Excellency Hakim Hajoui, in order to celebrate Hanukkah. It was a very beautiful celebration, and I found myself particularly enthralled by this model of coexistence. And so I started writing more about it, and I started researching the history, and I became very fascinated with North African history, particularly during the colonial period, and in particular the history of North African Jews, of which I am one. Much of my work focuses on recreating this model, making sure that we combat extremism, but that we're also educating people on the uniqueness of their neighbors, even if their neighbors are radically different from them.
So you grew up in the UK, in London, where
Yes.
you moved as a kid, and then you went to university and you chose to study history. Why choosing history? Was it an evidence for you? And did your family history maybe shape, in a way, your academic journey?
Well, yes, I have to say history was definitely one of my first choices when I was looking at what I wanted to study. First off, it was not necessarily something I wanted to do for a career, but I was good at it. I had always had an affinity for historical exploration. I really loved reading historical books about pretty much any particular period. It didn't matter. I was enthralled by the study of the subject. And my family history certainly did play a part in it. I don't know if my family wanted me to be a historian per se, but my great-grandfather, Alberto Verdugo, was a historian. He went on to become a journalist and a very avid linguist, spoke about 10 languages, was very focused, quite like me, on Jewish-Muslim relations. He memorized the Quran at an early age, despite being completely Jewish. He spoke classical Arabic as well. And he started working for the Pasha of Marrakesh, Tamir Glaoui. And this was all due to his fascination with the historical underpinnings of Morocco and of Sephardi Jewry. And these are interests that I seem to have inherited. So it was certainly normal for me to want to study it further at university. The particular set of interests that I acquired there were not entirely orthodox. Many people do not focus on French colonial propaganda in North Africa. And actually, when I did my final year dissertation, when it came to that point, after about 2.5 years of study, I realized that the research that I intended to do actually had almost no Anglophone precedent. There is no English language work on French colonial Africa that looks, or French colonial North Africa, that examines the propagandistic visuals of empire. And so I was very interested in that. And it gave me also a very challenging, thoughtful insight as to how images and visual media are being used as forms of control. And that is how it translates, actually, to much of the geopolitical work that I do right now, which is in monitoring patterns of extremism, and especially by what people watch.
I saw on your social media that you present your journey as bridging scholarship and storytelling, which is quite out of the box. I would like to hear you about the interconnection between both. To what extent history, that you chose as your main discipline, which is an academic discipline, and which is also an analytical way of explaining human evolution and the world, helps connect with people, helps tell and write stories, helps highlight, preserve, and sometimes even maybe revive specific narratives, identities, memories?
It's a good question. I have to say, scholarship is often focused on the scholars, more on what they're actually studying. And that's very regrettable. We do focus on academics more than what they teach. And this is something that I found, at least in the Anglophone world. We cultivate a relationship with our professor, and that's fine, that's amazing. But we often fall into the trap of not allowing overlapping stories to enter our lives. And that's where the element of storytelling comes in. Scholarship in history is actually the practice of stratifying stories. That's what it is. You take a number of narratives, stories, evidence that's given in these stories, and then you organize them. You make them better. You put them into a better format, something that is actually digestible, something that a reader would like. A good historian is fundamentally a good writer. That's 100%. But a good historian also has to be a storyteller, at least when they are telling the stories that they actually put together. Outside of music, art, or other forms of aesthetically pleasing engagements, people often connect most through stories, through oral traditions, through the written word. They love getting involved in this kind of very deeply human practice. And so it only makes sense that a historian and a storyteller actually have very similar roles, just different levels of, I guess, elitism and privilege surrounding them. I mean, you need a degree to be a historian. You don't necessarily need one to be a storyteller. They both play absolutely crucial roles in the functioning of a human society. Without storytellers, we can't pass on culture. And without historians, we can't really preserve the stories that the storytellers tell. And that's where scholarship and storytelling really unlocks its true potential.
You evoked post-colonial studies. Today, there are a lot of what we call memorial wars or oppositions about historical events and times, especially with post-colonial studies. We don't look back at the same events with the same perspective in Western countries and in Eastern countries. And among historians themselves, there is no universal consensus. It's impossible to have consensus. For example, about the history of Al-Andalus in Spain, which is today mainly presented as the golden age of coexistence, convivencia between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Or we don't have the same consensus as well about the history of Jews in Northern Africa and maybe in Morocco. As a historian yourself, but with this very specific family history, which is embedded in Moroccan history and identity, how do you deal with that?
You make a good point about memorial wars. And this was actually something that was pointed out towards the end of the 20th century by quite a famous French historian, Pierre Nora. And Pierre Nora authored a particularly harrowing academic article called Between Memory and History, les lieux de mémoire, the sites of memory. And what he essentially was saying in that article is that we have sites of memory, as in monuments and statues and museums and galleries, because we no longer have in the modern world what he called milieu de mémoire, the environments of lived memory. And so what we end up doing to ourselves as a culture is making spaces, be those physical spaces or digital spaces, sites of conflict more than collaboration. And that is something that I felt really needs to change. You've pointed out, for example, that there are competing views about, say, the history of Al-Andalus, about the Inquisition, about Jewish history in Morocco. And I think one thing that people often lack when they explain these particular environments is nuance. Narrative without nuance is propaganda. And that's something that I learned very early on when I was working actually for CAMERA, which was the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. And I worked for them just in the aftermath of October 7th. I had started working for them in June. October 7th happened, and then I had to stop working for them, unfortunately, because of the mental load and also the academic requirements of my course. I have to say that's where it really started dawning on me the problem that we have on our hands. Now, particularly when it comes to post-colonial studies, we often don't focus on the lived experiences of colonial subjects themselves. We don't focus on their own ambitions, their dreams, their goals, their memoirs, their stories. Memoirs, actually, in the academic historical space have become almost of a taboo, in that because memoirs of individuals are always assumed to be presenting themselves in the best light, they therefore are not trustworthy as historical evidence. I mean, I would say that it does a very great disservice to the study of historical periods where all we really have left are memoirs. And so we get to a point where we stop connecting with the individuals affected by the history, and we start looking at these great forces that we can't really explain. Herbert Butterfield, for example, was a Whig historian who pointed this out quite clearly, that history is not made by great forces. It's built by people. And so we need to look at people first and foremost. We need to look at what they thought. Whether that's the masses or an individual, the insight is the same. You always have value in what people think, and you shouldn't simply look at economic charts or sociological theories of what ultimately has affected humans. When we talk about history, typically we talk about human history as an academic discipline. We're not talking about prehistory. That's for the anthropologists and the archaeologists. And so as a historian, I'm focused on human beings, and I apply that in much of the rest of my work.
You evoked it earlier, but I would like to go back on it. Peacebuilding and counter-extremism, which are part of your expertise. Can you explain what it is in details and your different activities dealing with it?
The counter-extremism aspect of my work was actually quite recent, I must say. I was not so interested in pursuing the fight against extremist groups until the February 2025. Of course, I had been very concerned about the rise of Islamist rhetoric and so on and so forth in universities and in institutions across the West, but taking up the actual fight was something that I did, like I said, at the end of February. 2 days after my birthday at King's College London, there was a targeted riot at an event in which my dear friend and colleague Faiz Alavi, who's an Iranian artist and very prominent voice now in the Iranian women's movement and liberation movement in general. There was an event that was dedicated through a geopolitical forum to promoting Israeli-Iranian dialogue and how we can move away from conflict and more towards connection. And about 20 minutes in, that got shouted down by pro-Palestinian thugs who not only chased us through the university, but also started getting physical with security staff. It later transpired that some of them have ideological affinities with Salafist groups, and it also appeared that many of them were actually sympathetic to the Islamic regime in Iran. Now, that for me was highly concerning. One, because of the evident security risk of allowing such people onto campus. I mean, how could that have happened? But two, the fact that such things can be coordinated and nothing is done about it. And what that inspired me to then do was research these groups, research the individuals who are working for these groups or supporting them in the UK, and actually putting together research that can be submitted to either the UK government or other parties in order to ensure that this is acted upon. Now, I view counter-extremism and peacebuilding as complementary. You can't build towards peace if the foundations are still being rotten from the inside by extremist actors. We also have to delineate, as people like Dr. Wael Saleh have done, between Islam and Islamism. When I talk about counter-extremism, much of my work is actually focused on counter-Islamism. The far-right extremism does exist, as does far-left extremism, but the one that poses an existential threat, I would say, to societies right now in the West, and especially in Europe, is the Islamist threat. There are about 40,000 individuals in the UK currently are on a list of what we would describe as jihadist sympathetic or jihadist affiliated. And that is very, very worrying as a statistic. And it's certainly something that with my youth and my age, I hope to fight against. Counter-extremism is also not only reactive, but it's preventative. And so not only writing, but also giving information to the government about what they can do in terms of educational policy to de-extremify curricula is also something that I'm currently looking at. Lecturing at universities, lecturing at secondary schools. These are projects that I'm currently working on. And it's something that needs to be done, because the forces of extremism expand inexorably to fill the spaces that are afforded for them. If we close those gaps, then we actually start creating a world in which people start to see things outside of that observable universe of extremism. And they start to see the humanity that lays past. And so, again, it complements a lot of my work as a historian. If you're not familiar with what's happened in the past, what the facts are, then you are not going to be able to move past extremism. I've met many an extreme academic. I've met many intellectuals who espouse views that I would say are simply reprehensible, not because they are factually incorrect or lacking in any kind of, I would say, historical backing, but just they are so extreme that it's very difficult to see how their views, if applied, would help anyone. And so that's mainly what I'm working against right now. And I think a lot of people should start paying attention to it because it is a problem. But that doesn't mean we can't solve it.
Is it for all of these reasons that you are very committed for Jewish and Muslim relationships? And why is it so meaningful today?
Definitely. For me, what matters most is that we are aware that there has been hostility in the past, but that we are also aware that it can be healed, that there is a path forward. We don't get anywhere by ignoring historical reality. Actually, we regress instead of progressing. Unfortunately, those who ignore historical reality the most tend to be those self-styled progressives that we see today, who unfortunately have wreaked a lot of havoc on our institutions. And it's at the very least reassuring to know that wartime policy is not dictated by such individuals. Jewish-Muslim relationships are very important, namely because, first off, there's a serious imbalance in terms of information and individuals. There's about 2 billion Muslims worldwide. There's about 15 million Jews worldwide. And so the number of Jews compared to the number of Muslims is infinitesimally smaller. However, we have resources at our disposal. We have a lot of knowledge. We have a lot of texts, scriptures, cultural markers that we should be willing and able to share with others, that we should be able to educate others about. Because if we don't, as Jews, at least myself as a Jew, then the people who are going to be telling my story are people who actually don't know me, are people who might hate me, actually. And so for me, it's important to proactively reach out to my Muslim neighbors and to any neighbors, to be honest. It doesn't matter whether they're Muslim or not. Everyone has to, at the very least, be informed about the Jewish position on certain matters, if we can even agree that there's any consensus in Judaism. But there is one Jewish story, I guess, and that's the story that I try and tell. And it's a story that is, of course, informed by my Moroccan heritage, because, like I said, Morocco has offered, especially Alawite Morocco, has offered that model of coexistence that I believe should be replicated elsewhere. Are there currently strains on the Jewish-Muslim relationship in Morocco in the wake of the war between Israel and Hamas? Of course, but that's in every country, unfortunately. And now we have a lot of work to do. Post-war reconstruction, in this particular case, seems to not just be associated with the territories themselves, but with the globe. And especially with a conflict of this nature, we have to work twice as hard.
1 month ago, it was the 5th anniversary of the signature of the Abrahamic Accords. It happened at a crucial moment when Israel attempted to eliminate Hamas leaders in Doha, in Qatar. Everybody feared the suspension, or worse, the end of the Accords. But at the end, the UAE did not suspend their relationships with Israel, and Moroccan officials did not react out loud to these events. Now we are 3 days after the implementation of the ceasefire, as we mentioned in introduction, between Israel and Hamas. We've seen the release of the Israeli hostages, and as you mentioned again, the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, which gathered not only the most major Arab and Muslim states, but also the Western ones to support Trump's plan. How did you welcome such news?
First off, The proposed suspension of the Abraham Accords, I never took it particularly seriously. Number one, there's been so much development, not only just in trade, but also in defense cooperation and security between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, as a direct result of the diplomatic initiative of the Trump administration in putting together the Abraham Accords, that it would have been, I would say, rather suicidal internationally just to completely dissolve them or disband them, or even to exit them with the hopes of once again returning. Israel and the UAE especially have cultivated a very close relationship. Israel and Morocco already had a very special relationship to begin with. And I mean, Israel and Bahrain, I can't think of two better sister countries. So it really has to be put into perspective that what Qatar, the state of Qatar, puts out on the international stage that is then proliferated by outlets like Al Jazeera is not always representative of diplomatic realities. Now, the strike on Qatar itself, I would say, I don't have all the facts. Again, I'm not an expert on the Gulf. However, what I would say is there is a reason why Qatar was targeted at this particular time. Continued intransigence vis-a-vis Israel and propagandizing against one of the belligerent parties in a war that you are actively negotiating is definitely not good faith. It's also not good faith to continue to host and fund members of the Hamas Politburo in Doha. It is also not good faith to urge repeatedly Hamas leaders in Gaza to keep the hostages, thereby prolonging the war and, of course, prolonging conflict and suffering for Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza alike. So the strike against Qatar was deliberate, definitely. It was also calculated. And I think, actually, given the result that we have now, perhaps it was the right decision. That doesn't mean that I agree with the fact that there was unfortunately a Qatari security member who lost his life in that strike. It could have been carried out in a more surgical manner. But we have to be aware of the realities on the ground. Qatar, unfortunately, is a very nefarious actor at the moment. That doesn't mean they always have to be. And I certainly hope that they find it within themselves to stop giving funding to these Islamist groups and jihadist militias worldwide. I certainly hope that they soften the editorial line of Al Jazeera so that it doesn't radicalize hundreds of thousands of young Arabs to join these groups and also millions of people worldwide. And I certainly hope that there will be reparations in some way from Qatar for the role that it has indisputably played in the propping up of Hamas. And again, many of these other groups, such as Hezbollah. That being said, the peace process. A deal was reached, albeit fragile, but now we have the hostages, and that is a very, very important development. I'm concerned about the 20-point proposal, namely the Board of Peace that Trump proposed, which would oversee the creation of a transitional authority for Gaza, for the territory.
With Tony Blair as a director?
Precisely. This, of course, would be chaired by President Trump, but he has floated a role for Sir Tony Blair. I am not particularly sure. Essentially having what we would call a new British mandate for Palestine would help solve this conflict or solve the problem of Gaza reconstruction. I'm also not entirely sure how President Trump plans to deliver on the commitments that he has made whilst Hamas remains in power in Gaza and evidently refuses to disarm. He has said publicly that Hamas would be disarmed violently if need be. Whether that means putting American boots on the ground in Egypt to have them go into Gazan territory is certainly up for debate, but I think he might. I think he might do it, especially if he's very keen on delivering on this plan. Now, that would create a whole host of issues, problems or solutions, I'm not sure. Again, it's very up in the air at the moment and it can change at a moment's notice. Hamas, increasingly unpopular, I must say, on the Gaza Strip. It's very likely that the efforts of President Trump would be supported by local Gazan militias, and they would be able to, at the very least, clear out the military presence of Hamas through various kinetic offensives. The ideological strand, though, persists, and it also persists at various levels in Western institutions, not only academic, unfortunately, where we've seen, again, a lot of Qatari influence, but also political. There are multiple members of, let's say, UK Parliament and also in Congress who are known for their views sympathetic to Islamist groups and especially more worryingly towards jihadist militia groups such as Hamas. And so that is a development that will have to be addressed. So the disarmament of Hamas really is the only obstacle right now that lies in the way. There is also the issue of the delivery of remaining deceased hostages to Israel. As far as I'm aware, about 4 of them have been confirmed to be delivered so far. That it's unfortunate that Hamas have not been able to locate the rest. That's what they're telling media at the very least. I'm not entirely sure if I trust them, but that's part of the deal. Israel also has to receive deceased hostages so that they can be buried on Israeli soil where they belong. Now, perhaps as the Gaza reconstruction program progresses, we will be able to locate more deceased hostages and these will be transported during the transitional period to Israel. It wasn't entirely clear in the ceasefire agreement what timeline there was for all of this to happen. I think the main priority was to get living hostages out, as it should be. So we're looking at a very multivariate problem here, but there's also hope. There's hope for the future. There are opportunities. My hope is that Hamas disbands and disarms. I don't think they're going to do that without a fight, though, and that's where my worries lie.
But don't you think that what we saw with the first phase of the plan during the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, with the support, for example, of Turkey and of Qatar, which are alongside Iran, the main allies of Hamas, don't you think that what we saw is a shift of alliances in the MENA region? And do you think that this can pave the way for an Abrahamic alliance? And if yes, how would you define it?
Would say in this particular case, it's not so much a shift of alliances as it is a shift of interests. It is no longer in the interest of Turkey or Qatar to continue to protect Hamas on the diplomatic stage. Does that mean that they have lost their ideological affinity with the group? Absolutely not. I don't think we should go there. However, what we should do is, as you've said, restore the Abrahamic contingent of Middle East and North African diplomacy, one that is currently being led by the Trump administration. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but everyone is going to have to make concessions of some sort if they want to have a new status quo that focuses on peace and construction. And for one, certainly hope that in the advent of the reconstruction and the ceasefire, that it will be harder for extremist groups that have capitalized upon this conflict so much to gain as much favor and currency, social currency, as they have on the Arab street in various countries. There are countries that I'm particularly at this moment against prospectively joining the Abraham Accords, mainly because I think that there's a lot of de-radicalization that needs to happen at a political and cultural level before they can join. One country is Libya, for example, which is unfortunately very unstable at the moment. It's been overrun by mercenaries and jihadist groups, and Qatar. Qatar, quite frankly, I'm not entirely sure if they fully intend to play ball. And I think that they are going to still continue to present a problem, especially in academia. They have shown no signs of slowing down their funding for Western academia, funding which is contingent on a particular academic line of approach that favors the Qatari royal family and their interests. I don't particularly think that they are going to soften Al Jazeera's editorial line, which radicalizes young people, even though I hope that they do, and I hope that they will be pressured to. I hope that it will be no longer in their interest to do so. That's quite frankly what I hope, because this particular outlet has a vast audience at its disposal. And it's a great shame that the state of Qatar has decided to use it to propagandize rather than deliver the truth.
We mentioned the Abraham Accords and Trump's peace plan for Gaza as peace frameworks, which are decided by the states because they are diplomatic initiatives with a top-bottom approach. Both of them highlight the importance of coexistence and shared prosperity for all the peoples in the region, which are our core values at Abramundi. What do you think about the reverse? So a bottom-up approach resting on interfaith dialogue, maybe cross-boundaries initiatives to spread this Abrahamic spirit in Eastern societies.
I think it's a perfect idea. I think, though, that interfaith cooperation can only go so far without eventually including the often uncomfortable discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It may come as a shock to some people who are watching this, but up until October 7th, it was actually policy of the Jewish community at any interfaith events not to discuss Israel, not to talk about contemporary Israeli politics, not to discuss at all how Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other faith groups are affected by developments in the region. And so that, I would say, was actually a hindrance, because come October 7th and the strain on religious connections that later happened, meant there was nothing really to fall back on, because we had never simulated these discussions before. So cultural borders have to be eroded, but they have to be eroded with honesty. We cannot continue to engage in interfaith discussion without being unafraid to boldly embrace the uncomfortable ones. We have to look again at history in order to be able to do that, because it's only through a keen, solid, and kind understanding of history that we begin to start healing those divides. People are people. People can change. There's often a lot of cynicism in this world, or the understanding that people don't change, that they never change their affiliations, their ideological patterns, how they think, how they feel. There's actually a lot of evidence to the contrary, that people become more conscientious and generally kinder over time. And there's no reason to believe that if we start now, especially with young people such as myself, by proactively reaching out to people who are very different from us, that we can't in 5, 10, 20 years' time get to a point where someone's immediate reaction to conflict is not to blame their neighbor, but actually to reach out to them.
What would it be? This kind understanding of history from an Arab perspective, from a Jewish perspective, and from a Western perspective?
From the Arab perspective, there has to be a reconciliation of the past. Arab history is often very tied to Islamic history, even though there are some differences, notable ones, Arab being an ethnicity and Muslim denoting a faith or religious belief. But the Arab history and the Arab character of the modern day is almost inseparable from the Islamic identity. Now, what that means is that there are plenty of people across the Arabic-speaking world who find themselves unable to reconcile with the history of how they came to speak Arabic, for example. It's not normal under normal circumstances that Moroccans, Algerians, Tunisians speak Arabic. There is a reason why they do. It's not under normal circumstances that Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians even, and Jews came to speak Arabic. There's a reason why that happened. And the reason was expansion. And often that expansion was characterized by a complex network of not only, of course, cooperation, but also treachery, betrayal, bloodshed. And we have to ensure that people are made aware of this in a way that doesn't sledgehammer their identity. We're not telling Arabs or Muslims that they're bad. We're saying that it's not because bad things have happened in the past that they need always be like that. And I think that's kinder reading of history than the current anti-Islam camp in the West is doing now. The anti-Islam camp in the West, unfortunately, have become infiltrated by very extremist actors, people who hate just to hate. And it's very unfortunate that they would see 2 billion people as simply the product of brainwashing. Jewish readings of history. Well, a Jew is by nature a historian, I would say. We care very deeply about the stories that we hold. The story of Jewish peoplehood, for example, is fascinating. Jewish history is world history. The story of being a liberated people, of being oppressed, of being persecuted, of forming our own nation, of reclaiming our land, of falling into civil war, of falling into temptation, idolatry, of reclaiming this kind of sacred heritage, and then also of losing it to colonial and imperial dispossession. I mean, these are all themes that anyone could connect with, not just Jews. And so that's why I say that Jewish history is global history. A kind reading of Jewish history would be one that accepts the fact not only that Jews and Jewish culture are indigenous to modern-day Israel, but that there is a reason why the state of Israel must exist. And we saw that reason very plainly and very clearly on October 7th. A Western reading of history, if we are to be kind, must be one that absolves the European, especially Westerner, of the guilt that has been imposed upon them for complicity in colonial systems that far preceded them and do not exist today. It's often a source of great discomfort and great discontent and internalized guilt in many Western societies that they are somehow faring much better than everyone else because they only knew how to plunder. I don't think it's a particularly fair reading of history. I mean, up until the fin de siècle, the onset of the 20th century, pretty much everyone was suffering in some way, shape, or form, unless they were top of the food chain and in the highest 1% of global wealth. And so it's unfair to think that there's simply this monolithic, oppressive West that has done nothing except wreak havoc upon the world. It's not kind, and it's not productive. And I certainly hope that people will come to eventually see the flaws and the multiple errors, not only factual, but also in principle, of such views that have most notably been espoused by individuals such as Edward Said in Orientalism, and that have done more to set back the process of Middle East peace than pretty much any other intellectual movement.
So healing, thanks to a honest reading of history, if I sum up.
Yes.
What do you think about another way of healing and reconciliating the peoples? What do you think about an Abrahamic or mosaic narrative to shape the region's future, which is a shared future between Arabs and Jews, between Muslim, Jews, and Christians, and all the other minorities which are living in the Middle East? It's very important not to forget them. Exactly,
as you pointed out. A truly Abrahamic narrative is one that acknowledges and celebrates and values plurality. And it is one that recognizes the use of having different people in your environment, people who think differently, people who act differently, and people who worship differently. When Abraham had his in the Bible, in Torah, had his tent fully open on three sides at places like Mamre, for example, he didn't particularly care which god you worshipped. If you came, you were a guest. You were someone worth sharing food with, worth sharing scarce resources with. It's very important when we look at the symbolism that and the messages and the moral psychology that we find in the Bible, that much of this takes place in the desert, because in the desert, food, shelter, water is pretty scarce. And so in order to be willing to share that with people you've just met, you have to be very brave. Abrahamic narratives demand bravery, demand the bravery to see past the differences and to see what you share with someone else and what you might have yet to share with someone else. And there's tremendous beauty in those kinds of narratives because they work.
If you could make 3 wishes for the MENA region in 10 years, namely in 2035, Aurèle, what would they be?
My 3 wishes. My first one is, well, in accordance with the wishes of President Trump and colleagues, that there will be no more global wars, at least not of the scale that we've seen in Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Gaza. The world is tired of these kinds of conflicts, and they don't help anyone. And so I sincerely hope that we are going to be entering an era of peace building. And I'm very happy to be one of the individuals who's going to be working on that. It's very exciting. My second wish is for the younger demographic to get involved, actively invested in the Abrahamic peace framework. I am certainly not the only 20 to 30-year-old who is involved in this process. There are plenty of people. However, it would be very important for the existing patrons of the Abraham Accords to recognize that there needs to be a federated space where young people can congregate in that way and celebrate their shared Abrahamic orientation. The third and final wish, is actually for greater understanding of cultural history and an understanding of why plurality matters. We often think of studying other cultures in our own terms, and it would be really incredible if we could think about studying history or learning the history of other cultures from the position of those other cultures. There's actually a very beautiful practice in Judaism, which is called chavruta, the concept of learning through friendship, which is that when you are learning a particular material, you always have a friend next to you who is able to offer a second opinion. And if we can do that in the Jewish tradition, there's no reason why we can't scale it globally and apply it elsewhere. I would be more than happy to learn parts of the Quran or parts of the New Testament with my Muslim and Christian counterparts, and I would only hope that that kind of feeling is reciprocated if they ever need any kind of wisdom when it comes to the Torah. There are plenty of opinions to go around, plenty of not so useful ones, but there are many useful ones. And those are the kinds of initiatives that can really drive the world. So in summary, I would really say a shared spirit of learning.
Thank you very much, Aurèle, for this demanding and challenging conversation. I was very happy to host you. Thank you, and see you soon, I hope.
See you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate it, to share it, and to subscribe to Abratalks. Follow Abramundi on all social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp. Stay tuned and see you soon.